Hi, everybody. I'm Anne Mohanraj. I'm here for the Speculative Literature Foundation, and I'm at WindyCon 48 in Chicago 2022, and I am here interviewing the two author guests of honor, Kelly Robson and Alex Dellamonica. Did I pronounce that right? Dellamonica. Thank you. Alex Dellamonica. I've been calling you Alex all weekend. I was like, wait, I know their last name, but am I going to say it right? And you write under two names, actually. A.M. Dellamonica for your fantasy, but you've also been writing thrillers recently under a different name.
Yes, solar punk thrillers under L.X. Beckett.
L.X. Beckett. Okay. Awesome. And we're interviewing them together, mostly because it's the end of the con and we're just squeezing this in under the wire before they run off to the airport. But also, they're married and they live together in Toronto, and we're delighted to have an opportunity to chat with them. So they're now leaning into each other and looking super cute. So Kelly has moved over to genre writing fairly recently, I want to say 2015.
That's right.
Yeah, and has been taking the genre by storm, getting like award nominations for everything under the sun, Hugo, Nebula, Sturgeon, Locus, etc., and so on. And I feel like, have you won something?
I won a Nebula Award.
Yay! Yeah, congratulations.
And 3 Aurora Awards. That's a Canadian Science Fiction Award.
Nice. And maybe a Sunburst? Was there a
I'm the Sunburst.
Alex won the Sunburst Award.
Yeah, for my first book, Indigo Springs.
Nice, which is another Canadian genre award.
And I have won Aurora as well.
Excellent. One of the things I love about Canada is how much they are supportive of their artists and writers. I remember talking to Nalo Hopkinson at one point because she had been working for the Canadian Arts Council, and was sort of saying that since America was so dominant and as a publishing force, it was easy for Canadian authors to kind of get drowned out. And so it was really important to have Canadian grants and awards to help make Canadian authors visible. I'm curious whether you would agree.
No,
in
for
your
sure.
experience.
Absolutely. So the important thing is like plenty of Canadian writers publish in the U.S. But where it's important is for Canadian publishing. Because American publishing is such a huge world force, Canadian publishing can really almost go nowhere in comparison to it because of the competition in the market. So it's important for the Canadian government to support Canadian publishing and Canadian artists, because otherwise there would be no Canadian focused art. Yeah, right. So
Yeah, the grant system is very, very generous compared to the U.S. in many ways. I've gotten a couple of comparatively large Canada Council grants over the years, in the $5,000 to $10,000 range.
That's terrific.
And it's something I'm always so very grateful for, and it allows projects, of course, that just would never see the light of day otherwise. Right. Like I've just been commissioned to help a virtual reality team create a presentation from one of my poems. And that's totally a grant-funded project, and we've only just started, so I don't know what shape it will take yet, but it's such an obscure niche, cool thing.
It sounds really, really cool.
Yeah, I'm excited about it.
I have to admit, this has hurt me professionally, because once there was a Canadian TV company that was going to adapt one of my stories for television, and then they reached out to me and they were like, we did not realize that we are funded by the Canadian Arts Council and we have to use Canadian authors. And I was sad for me, but good for you, so I approve.
There was definitely an element of that with the VR poetry thing, where they were like, we picked from our basket of Canadian authors for this project.
Nice. So, well, let's go back, and maybe Kelly, could you talk a little bit about sort of your entry into genre publishing and like what led you to it, or what your first steps were?
So I had been a book-based life form my entire life. And I especially read a lot of short fiction when I was a kid. And the first short fiction that I remember reading was Saki and Oscar Wilde's fairy tales, which are very, very depressing. But so I've always been crazy about reading, and specifically crazy about science fiction. Narnia was a big thing for me. I always wanted to be a writer. But I suffered from a lack of self-confidence, a lack of really needing permission to do it. So
there's a great essay in Wildlife where Natalie Goldberg talks about, it's a 2-page thing about needing permission and writers waiting for that permission. And she says, she basically says, look, I give you all permission. You're reading this essay. I give you permission. Really, you have to just kind of take it.
You do have to take it. And part of the problem was my family is terminally uncultured, real cultural poverty. My parents did not care about movies. They didn't care about TV. They didn't really care about books or learning or anything like that. So I was a real outlier in my family. But when I was 38, I've been married to Alex for a long time, and Alex wrote and never doubted themselves and never doubted that they had permission to write. I did.
Yeah.
And I also look at Alex the way Alex would just kind of approach writing with this laser focus and think, I couldn't do it that way. But what I didn't know is that there are so many different ways to be an artist. There's so many different ways to approach making art. You don't have to do it the way somebody else does it. As a matter of fact, you shouldn't do it the way somebody else does it.
You probably shouldn't do it the way I do it.
You have to do it the way it works for you. So when I was 38, I told myself, I realized that if I never gave writing a really good try, and I had written a few things, if I never gave writing a really good try, it would be the worst regret of my life. So I did NaNoWriMo in 2005, and NaNoWriMo being the National Novel Writing Month, where people in November commit to writing 50,000 words of a book in the month of November, which works out to, whether that be, all at once, thousands of words a day, or, an equal amount of words per day, which works out to 1,666 words per day, which is the way I did it. But what was good about it is that it forced me to just write and ignore the voice in my head that told me to stop and not do it.
I think a lot of people having a class or something like that, is also provides a similar help. It's structure, right? The structure that's I have assignments and, I'm now going to follow the assignments because someone else is telling me to do this, right?
Exactly.
Even if it's just, this big agreement that we're all going to write a novel in November. It didn't work for me. I have tried NaNoWriMo 3 times, and all of them, it fizzled out within 3 days. So clearly it's not my model, but it works really well for a lot of people.
Yeah, it does. And not everybody's the same. And if NaNoWriMo doesn't work for you, by all means, don't do it. But it helped me. Yeah. And from then, I was off. I wrote 2 trunk novels. One of them cribbing plot from Shakespeare, and the other one cribbing characters from Jane Austen, which were good training wheels to write a trunk novel on. And then I got some really good writing advice that helped me write my own thing with cribbing from nobody. And I can tell you about that advice later or now.
Now is great. Go for it.
Okay, so the advice was, and this was from Stephen Barnes at Oricon in 2012, and it was, the advice was, when we get an idea for a story, we usually know either the character or the problem. And if we know the character, we ask ourselves, what is the worst thing that could happen to this character? And even better, how can I make them do it to themselves? If we have the problem, we can ask ourselves, who is the worst person to give this problem to? And for me, this really was a fantastic key for me. So I had been working on a story called Waters of Versailles for several months, and it was the first thing that I had started, like the first good, idea that I had that was cribbing from nobody. It was my own idea only, and I couldn't get past page 6. And no matter how many times I tried rewriting the story from scratch, I just couldn't get it past page 6. I knew where the story was going. I knew what I wanted to have happen, but it just wasn't working. Which is great if you have a true sense of when something isn't working. That can be a real helpful thing for a writer. And what Stephen Barnes said about having an idea in your head of the problem of the story and giving it to the wrong person made me realize that the reason why I couldn't get past page 6 was because I'd given the problem to the right person. There was no reason why that character couldn't have solved the problem on page 6. That's why the story wasn't working, because it would be artificial to keep pushing them through the problem when there's no reason for them not to solve it. So
that's a really interesting framing. I thought at first you were talking about something a little different. Like one thing that happens in my classroom, I see this a lot with students, is they'll write a story and it's not as gripping as it should be. And it's because their protagonist is not the person who has the most at stake, right? So it's not so much about who's solving the problem necessarily, but just like the viewpoint character isn't the right viewpoint character. And if you just shifted it so it was the person who has the most to lose, the most to gain, suddenly we're going to be more invested in it, right? So, but I think that twist on it that you're talking about is also really interesting. So that's wild.
It was key for me.
Yeah.
It was super key for me.
That's very cool.
And the story ended up being one of my most successful. It was one of the first things that I sold. And Ellen Datlow bought it for Tor.com, which is a huge market that everyone wants to break into. And it was nominated for the Nebula for the World Fantasy Award. It would have been nominated for a Hugo, but that was one of the sad puppy years. So,
I had my novella was a close thing as well. I think it was like it didn't make it because of the sad puppy. I was so mad. Anyway, let's not go there.
No, let's not go there. But so that was really, really good advice, and I still draw on that advice. I tell everybody the advice. I tell new writers the advice because you never know what little piece of advice is going to knock things loose for you. And it's going to be different for everyone.
I also I sort of like what you had to say about sort of looking at Alex working and that being a motivator for you, even though if you're going to approach it differently. And I think that's so my husband is a mathematician. Our ex-girlfriend has a philosophy doctorate, and part of the reason I ended up going to grad school for creative writing is I was jealous of their doctorates. I was like, I want a doctorate, like they have one. Why can't I have one too? And it was a really good move for my career. But it came purely out of, and I'm not sure it would have even occurred to me if I didn't have the model in front of me. And when you talk about, you're coming from a family that maybe doesn't value literary arts culture, and I don't know whether you also come from a community perhaps that doesn't.
Yeah, sure, small town.
Yeah,
mining, forestry.
Yeah, and I think that's a real challenge for a lot of my students is that they're coming from family environments, cultural environments, class environments that have not maybe had the luxury to be able to really, especially before the internet, it was hard to access a lot of literary cultural production, right, where they lived and in their communities. So, well, I'm glad you found us.
Thank you. Thank you, me too.
Alex, maybe you could talk a little about how you came to writing?
Yeah, absolutely. I learned to read when I was about 3 or 4, and then I started writing. My early works were heavily influenced by Dr. Seuss.
My earliest poem is about a unicorn tapping through the woods.
They were highly derivative, but Seuss-like doggerel comes easily to the 5-year-old mind, especially if you're reading a lot of it at the same time. I tried. There's this writer in Canada. He is only about 5 years older than I am, and his name is Gordon Corman. And he friggin' published a book when I was 13 years old. And so there I am in 4th grade, and there's a goddamn, can I swear? 13-year-old with a book in my book club thing that I get from school. I'm like, I'm getting behind.
This is like professional jealousy is a great motivator.
You're 9 years old.
So I wrote my first novel, and I was like, it barely filled a scribbler. There was just never a time when I didn't sort of have a writer identity. It feels, although memory is completely unreliable, it feels like it preceded my queer identity. It feels like it preceded my non-binary gender identity. It feels like it preceded everything. And I know that can't actually be true, but it was the thing I was trying to do artistically for as long as I can remember.
Wow.
And I started entering contests and submitting to places like Asimov's when I was in high school because my parents, though they certainly had aspects of their characters that were problematic, were not artistically impoverished. They actually valued the arts a lot. My father was a theater director, and my mother comes from this little town in Nevada that does not seem like it is artistically rich in any way, but somehow they value archaeology and arty stuff too. We hadn't really realized it till the first time I took Kelly back to Nevada for Christmas, and it was like we actually had stuff to talk about, and they didn't think it was weird when we went to the Reno Art Gallery, and it was kind of it was a weird experience, like of reappreciating something you took for granted as a kid. So because of that, and I think also it was one of those little pieces of male privilege I claimed before I understood how masculine I am in some ways. I didn't have problem feeling entitled to do it. I certainly have other issues, but I didn't worry about the quality. I sent it off to Shauna McCarthy the minute it was done, and
yeah, I'm actually kind of the same way, and I don't know where that comes from. That sort of arrogance, that sort of, of course I'm going to submit, and and I have a good chance of getting published. Right?
Another thing I'm extraordinarily grateful for is my first stories, even my first professional stories, came out in the age of print magazines, and therefore nobody will ever see those works except our archivist. And by the time I started to publish things online, because there were venues for that, I was quite a bit better. So. These are two very different models. You can have your first story be massively award nominated because it is amazing, or you can work your way up through the semi-pros with some very dodgy stuff.
You can even start, I think my first year I was writing poetry and sending it to very obscure places I found in Poets Market, which was great for my confidence because, if you write a poem about fishing and send it to the fly fishing magazine, they don't get that many submissions, right? And so your odds are very good of getting published. So
and then you're like, author!
Yes, exactly. My dad was very proud. So that's right. That's right. So it's actually, so it gave me, I think, a big confidence boost that first year, and that made it easier to start submitting to semi-pros and then pros and so on and so forth. So I think it's it's nice to make the dazzling debut, though. That sounds like it was sort of fabulous, but also maybe nerve-wracking.
No, it was fabulous.
It was just fabulous.
It was great. Absolutely fabulous. Not nerve-wracking. Not one of those people who feel as I had already gone through my crisis of self-confidence and beaten it, so it didn't bother me. It was absolutely freaking thrilling. I would walk. All of my dreams came true.
Oh, that's lovely.
It was nice. It is nice.
So, let me ask about moving to books. So, you've been writing short fiction, Alex, and at some point you started writing novels. Was Child of a Hidden Sea your first novel? No.
No. Child of a Hidden Sea is my third published novel. Okay. My first two books were called Indigo Springs and Blue Magic.
Are they standalones?
No, they're a duology.
They're a duology, okay.
Indigo Springs is about a trio of millennials who are sharing a house in Portland, and who are messily entangled with each other because they're sort of having a three-way unrequited pining problem. And they discover a wellspring of magic in the basement. And it is magic that doesn't legitimately belong to them and has been fucked over by colonization, and transmuted as a result to the point where it is virtually toxic. But they start playing with it because, white people. And by the time they've figured out how they could arguably use it and what it is, they've accidentally released a massive amount of this magic into the ecosystem of the Pacific Northwest, basically creating a enchanted forest throughout Cascadia that is filled with semi-magical animals who are getting out of the forest, much to the U.S. military's distress, and randomly attacking people.
That's awesome. So it sounds like indigenous concerns, environmental concerns are pretty central to your work there.
Yes, and in a lot of ways, the thing that got slighted in that book was the indigenous stuff. Like it was a slightly different time. It came out in I want to say 2007 or 8, and our conversation hadn't quite moved to the point that it's at now in Canada. And I, as a way of not appropriating, I sort of created names for the peoples of the lands that they had messed over, and didn't use actual indigenous gods, for example. And it's an uneasy balance.
It's tricky figuring out what the right thing is to do.
And the queer conversation has changed a lot since then too, because Astrid's female parent Ev is a trans man who's never done anything about it, and they magically transition through the course of the two books. So they get that thing that is often a cliche in science fiction of a certain era, where they change sex immediately. And I think I did okay with them being like, oh, this doesn't actually address everything about transition. But I sometimes look at it now and think, but it does feel a little hokey.
Well, but I think we try these things, and in the moment that we're in, and if 10 years later we look at it and we're like, oh, we were not as far along in the conversation as we are now, and there's some stuff I was clearly missing back then, I would do it better now. I mean, I just generally feel like that's good, right? It means that society is progressing, right? So there's no point in trying to wait until we're all perfectly evolved, right?
No, of course
that's
not.
true. And
we
have it's a difficult question. How do you write fantasy set in North America? Right? You don't want to screw over the traditional stewards of the land by imposing European mythology on a North American landscape. But also you need to be able to write about the place that you live in. So what do you do? That's a question that I grapple with whenever I want to set something in the place where I grew up.
Exactly.
So Child of the Hidden Sea is a portal fantasy, right? So it starts in San Francisco, but very quickly moves to another world, which I'm about halfway through the novel right now, so not everything has been revealed yet. But there's some overlap with our world, but it seems like there was a clear divergence,
right?
Quite a long time ago. So do you feel like that helps you not need to engage with some of these issues because it is another land? Or maybe you can take them on in a more clear-cut way?
Both. I would say that colonization is less of an issue in Child of a Hidden Sea, although there are 200 sort of island nations, and they have a loose sort of United Nations confederation of sorts that is seafaring. So basically the world government travels by ships. Every country musters a ship to go be part of the government. But the issues there are more that sort of super state over umbrella-ing, I want to use that as a verb, over the 200 nations, is this uneasy coalition of about 100 slaveholding states and about 100 free states. And who knows where I got that historical example from. And in particular, there are 5 former pirate nations who are essentially the reason the Confederation was formed, was to stop them committing chaos on the high seas.
Right.
But they see piracy and murder as a sacred cultural practice that they would really like to go back to. And they have been sort of slowly agitating to try and set the slaver nations onto the free nations for a while to see if they can break things open enough to go back to their old ways. So there's agitation and shit disturbing.
Yeah. We just had a panel on transitions of power in government here at WindyCon, and we ended up talking a fair bit about what are the different types of governmental power, and do all governments get their power from the consent of the governed? What about slave, for example? Governments that do use slavery and impose power by at the at the mouth of a gun kind of thing. Anyway, not to go off into a whole long transition, but it's a topic that I think is really interesting and fertile ground for genre fiction, because that lets us ring changes and explore possibilities, right? That it's, when you're talking about our world, I feel like if I try to write about Sri Lankan politics, I get kind of down in the muck of the actuality very quickly, and it makes, I don't know, it's just trickier. It's trickier not to misstep as well, right? So
I write about slavery as an institution and enslaved peoples quite a bit, and the trilogy kind of crawls in that direction as you go through the 3 books.
I'm looking forward to finishing it. I have put aside reading it in order to do this interview, which I feel is a great sacrifice, everyone listening should be very grateful.
It's extremely gratifying how fast and enthusiastically you're reading that book.
I'm having a blast.
I'm loving seeing you be delighted with it.
So Kelly, I've read one of Kelly's novellas so far, which is High Times in the Low Parliament. So maybe if you could talk a little bit, you could talk about that book, or you could talk about, since I haven't read your other work, I don't know if the themes in that book are ones that you play with a lot, or if that's a new, if it's its own thing, maybe you could talk a little about it in your writing.
Yeah.
What are you drawn to? What do you end up writing about?
What I end up writing about a lot, which is not a huge part of High Times in the Low Parliament. High Times in the Low Parliament was a pandemic book that I wrote because I could not bear to write serious. I had to write light. So it is a departure from the stuff that I usually write about.
I gotta go dig up the others then.
Can I say, though, that I think that High Times in the Low Parliament has a lot in common with We Who Live in the Heart. And the idea of we are going to live our own way kind of thing. People being...
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah, maybe that's
one of my themes is the idea of people choosing parenthood or mentorhood or people wanting mentoring. So my first Tor.com novella came out in 2018. It's called God's Monsters and Lucky Peach. It is science fiction. It is time travel. And it posits a world where it's a post-scarcity world where the only thing that it is acknowledged throughout the world, the only thing that is of value is human time, people's time. And we already acknowledge that is a thing because companies like Google derive their economic power from people's attention.
Right.
And if people didn't, if nobody logged on to Google tomorrow, it would crash. The company would crash. It would die.
Sure.
So we already acknowledge that people have inherent economic value, even when all they're doing even when what they're doing isn't traditionally economically valued.
I think that the phrase I've seen that kind of refers to that is when we talk about services like Facebook and so on being quote unquote free, this phrase like, well, if you're not paying for it, it's because you're the product that they're selling, right?
Kind of, yeah. Kind of.
Your time, your attention,
Is Colgate getting more out of my attention than I'm getting out of using that service? That's...
I don't know Colgate.
Colgate, like...
the toothpaste?
Like the advertiser. How much is the advertiser getting out of me? Really?
Well, but you pay for your toothpaste, right?
That's true.
But for things that we think of as free, it's because they are selling our time and attention to their advertisers,
No,
right?
absolutely.
So which I think is basically what you're kind of saying.
No, you're absolutely right.
Right.
So I've always worked in my professional non-writing life. I've also worked worked in professional services companies. Mm-hmm. So companies where literally all they have to sell is human time. So lawyers, architects, environmental consultants, IT consultants, that sort of thing. That has been my career. So basically this is, I don't want to get into the economic backstory of my world building because I don't like to info dump world building into my books. I like to understand it 100% in my head and then have it implied through the whole thing.
Right.
But it is about an 83-year-old woman who is a fluvial geomorphologist, which was one of the most beautiful couple of words fluvial geomorphologist. She's a rivers expert.
Okay.
She is an ecologist.
I was like, I think I can parse that, but thank you for just telling us.
She studies rivers.
Okay.
And she's 83 years old. She's, the best at her business. She's a lot of experience. Yet, because 10 years ago, time travel was invented, basically the bottom has dropped out of basically investment from banks and other investors in the technologies that she has been supporting her whole life, which are environmental remediation technologies, because this is a very climate changed world. The bottom has dropped out of that because everybody is so interested in time travel, which is, I think, pretty realistic, right? What happens in the world is what gets funded. Yeah. And there's, so as any scientist will tell you, or any academic will tell you. So it is about her and a young woman named Kiki who wants to be her mentee, deciding that they are going to try to get a job doing a environmental investigation 4,000 years in the past.
Oh, that's so cool. That's great.
So
that is a new idea. I mean, I've never heard anything like it. So, I like time travel stories. So, I like that you're sort of bringing the science and it's fascinating. I'm not going to go off onto a whole time travel thing. I kind of wanted to talk about Annalee Newitz's time travel book but anyway.
Putting that aside. It's funny. Annalee Newitz is a friend, and we tend to we have some parallel brain cells because a lot of the things that I like are things that she likes. She's got a new book coming out in April. Alex and I have both read, and it's great. It's called The Terraformers.
Oh, I'm looking. I read all her stuff, so I can't wait. So,
she has a sentient moose. She has a sentient moose. Aww. I love moose. Anyway.
The moose is amazing. I liked the Terraformers even more than the time travel book. Yeah. And it's got that kind of wild, off the wall speculation that you see in John Clute and Paul D. Filippo, but it feels more grounded. Like I cared more about the characters, the story held together, even though it's got a massive time scale, and so it has the parts of the book take place with different character cohorts because there are centuries between the pieces.
Okay,
she's great.
Back to you guys. We could fangirl about Annalee for a while, but so that was the title of that one again.
That is God's Monsters and the Lucky Peach.
And that's the one that you are currently working on a novel sequel to.
Yeah. So I've been working on a novel sequel to that for years. It's the thing that I gave up when the pandemic hit, when I couldn't write serious anymore.
Yeah, you had to put it aside for a bit.
For me, what I have realized is that I didn't actually know how to write a novel when I started trying to write. What I wanted to write is a standalone novel-length sequel to God's Monsters and Lucky Peach. So writing a novel is not just writing a longer short story.
No.
And my novellas are very much short stories. They're they're not novels.
And I don't know if this is true for you. What I found when I tried to move to novels is that with a short story, even a longer one, I could hold the whole thing in my head.
Yeah.
And I just can't do that with a novel. And so then it becomes a challenge in terms of working on it, because every time, if there's a break in, like the short stories, I'll often draft in a day, right? I will, at least the first draft, will all come at once. And I can't, I'd have to stay awake for 60 hours to do that with a novel, right? This is not going to happen. So there have to be breaks, and often they are longer breaks because kids and life and teaching and whatever else gets in the way. And then there's such a cost to the mental time it takes to get back into the novel again, right. That switching cost. There's like a switching cost, and it ends up, I don't know. I find it very challenging, and each novel I've drafted also has a completely different structure and a completely different. It's like it's almost like writing the last novel didn't teach me anything that's useful in this novel. And I'm like, that seems unfair.
And yet many writers have that exact experience where they're like, I learned nothing from the previous book, and now I am at square one again. Thank you.
Yeah. So, well, I don't know. I'm not sure what there is to say about that in the solidarity, as we struggle through it.
Yeah. So I am now learning yet again, how to try and I think I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
We'll see.
So, well, let's talk about things that we do know, maybe, for a bit.
Yeah.
So when we were talking before this interview about characterization, and Kelly was saying that was something she loves to talk about, and maybe had some thoughts to share.
Yeah, I wrote about this in Clark's World magazine. Mm-hmm. There's an essay called Luke versus Han, an approach to characterization.
Nice.
So if anybody wants to read more about it, it is there. And there's also information about the advice that I got from Stephen Barnes that really kicked things loose for me creatively.
Great.
All right, so this is my own Kelly's prescription for characterization. A character should either know who they are or what they're doing. This examines the relationship between character and plot. Mm-hmm. With a focus on character behavior. Mm-hmm. It's about what a character does in the story. It's about how they express their agency. A character who knows what they're doing, but not who they are, has goals and is actively looking for a route to a clear outcome. Mm-hmm. A character who knows who they are, but not what they're doing, still makes their presence felt in the world because they have a strong sense of self. Mm-hmm. So, for example, Luke versus Han. Mm-hmm. In the first Star Wars movie, Luke does not know who he is. He has no idea. He's a kid. Mm-hmm. But he knows what he's doing. He's going to save that princess. That's his mission. Han Solo absolutely knows who he is.
Right.
He is the badass captain of the Millennium Falcon, and don't you forget it. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't know what he's doing. He's bipping around. He's taking opportunities where they come. He has no clear direction. Mm-hmm. So these are two classic characters with polar opposite psychological outlooks. Mm-hmm. A character should not know both who they are and what they're doing, because they've got nowhere to go psychologically. Mm. A character who neither knows who they are nor what they're doing is utterly passive and can't go anywhere. But this can also go very, very subtly. So you can have a character who knows who they are and what they're doing. Consider James Bond. Knows who he is and what they're doing. So all of the conflict has to be very external, and it has to be very plot focused, and there has to be a lot of razzle dazzle.
Yeah, I think it would also work for villains, right? Like the classic superhero bad guy does know who he is and what he's doing. He's going to take over the world, right? And then it's everybody else who's the point of view characters that are trying to deal with that.
Exactly. Yeah, very much. Yeah.
So that's really interesting.
And you can also say that, for example, Jane Eyre, one of my favorite characters, doesn't really know who she is at the beginning of the book. And she doesn't really know what she's doing. She's just surviving. But throughout the novel, we come to understand that she has an incredibly strong sense of self. She always has known who she is. And at the end, she knows what she's doing, right? She is a very, very forceful character. Yeah. We don't see that at the beginning, but she is, and she always has been. So in that case, in that story, the writing has to be incredibly beautiful, and it has to have a lot of psychological insight.
Well, I think the Gothics, I feel like, probably have a lot of that kind of approach where maybe the character doesn't know that they know at the beginning, right? And so it becomes a process of revealing to them, putting them in situations where they come to understand these central truths about themselves. Right.
So the character who doesn't know who they are by the end of the story will come to understand themselves. Right. At least a significant amount more. The character who doesn't know what they're doing by the end of the story will find their purpose.
It's a lot of my students are in college and they're 18, and I would say they do often write stories in which the protagonist neither knows who they are or what they're doing because that's kind of where they are in their lives at that moment. So that's very interesting to I'm going to put that to them and see what they think of it. Whether they,
this is my thing. I mean, it's not these tips that we throw out into the world are not prescriptive, but we offer them as...
No, it sounds very accurate to me, but I guess I'm saying, I'm not sure, okay, how does an 18-year-old who maybe doesn't know who they are, what they're doing, write a character who does? Is that going to be challenging for them? I'm not sure, right? And so... maybe not. Maybe they can just imagine themselves as someone who is, already figured it all out, right?
I think so. I certainly give an exercise about plot that is the character has a goal, and I have found that is not enough. For the exercise, I then have to explain that wanting a sandwich is usually not enough. Wanting a nap is usually not enough. And then so I had to put in some text about how it has to be a meaningful goal. And then I had to put in some examples. And for the older cohort of students I used to teach who were generally more middle-aged, that was less necessary.
Right. At Clarion, Nicola Griffith was one of my teachers, and she told us that if your character wants something badly, that's enough to create reader sympathy. It doesn't matter if the thing they want, and Nicola is lesbian and was often writing about same-sex attraction, and she said, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter for her straight readers because we all know what it is to want something or someone badly, and so we will fall into that emotion and follow the character, right? So, but just wanting something in a casual kind of way doesn't work so well. This is reminding me of there's a bit in Harper Hall, Anne McCaffrey's Harper Hall, where Manoli is talking to Lord Grog, and Manoli is 15 or 16 and is talking about how she wanted something badly, which is why the fire lizards teleported this thing to her, because they could feel the intensity of her emotion. And Lord Grog, who is older middle-aged man, kind of laughs and says, you want things badly when you're young. When you're my age, you've learned how to plan. So that was just kind of a funny perspective. All right, well, I've kept you for a long time, so for the last 15 minutes or so, because I don't want you to miss your plane, I'd love to just have you talk a little bit about sort of the writing life and what it is with both of you as writers, and how you find space for writing in your days, I don't know, just anything along those lines I'd love to hear.
So the single-minded focus Kelly mentioned basically boils down to I have a little touch of what some people would probably call persistent early waking insomnia, which basically means that like my mother and like my grandparents before her, I wake up at dawn or 5 a.m., whichever comes first. And so because this has been sort of my lifelong biology, I get up and I do whatever minimum things I need to do, mostly for my cats, and I write for a couple hours before any of the rest of the day has happened. And there have been variations on that over the years as time and circumstance permitted, but But generally speaking, I am one of those writers who writes every day, or 14 days out of 15, or 20 days out of 21.
You don't get distracted by the closet that needs cleaning? No.
Well, what I used to do pre-pandemic was I would invest in a latte somewhere, and I loved that. And what I do now is, in our condo building, there is a communal space, which is a library, which at 5 a.m. is a private space because it's only me. So I get up and I get dressed and I treat the cats their medicine, and then I go off to the library.
Oh, that's great.
It is sometimes hard for me to draft new fiction at home, the more so because I do a lot of my drafting as dictation first.
Oh, interesting.
Using voice-to-speech.
Do you really?
Yeah.
And see, that sounds tedious to me, because then I'd be, talking would be fine, but then I'd have to transcribe it later.
The software that transcribes it is faulty. It does introduce a lot of errors.
Yeah.
But it's beneficial to me because after writing so many novels and so much short fiction, I've kind of worn out my hands.
Yeah.
But it's also, you use a different part of your brain.
Right.
So I've written quite a few of my novels longhand, which also wasn't great for my hands. And what I've found is whatever I start with, I have to continue with. But it's nice to have that private space in the library to just dictate the first draft of a thing, and then later in the day I will clear out enough errors that I know what it is that the passage of text actually says.
Is it Dragon? What is the program that you use?
I actually just use the built-in speech-to-text provided by my phone.
Okay.
Because I found Dragon terrible.
I had a friend many years ago who used Dragon when she injured her hands, and so I was curious whether
it is extremely likely that it has improved a great deal since I was using it. But honestly, what the iPhone and or Google do for speech to text is fine.
Maybe I'll try it sometime.
And when you're writing genre fiction, you sometimes have to use a placeholder word for the made-up language.
That's right.
But I do have to transcribe within ideally 24 hours. This morning at 5 I was transcribing something I actually dictated 2 days ago, and there was some hard sledding there. I was like, this idea is lost. Whatever it is, I'll just have to stitch it back together on rewrite.
That's interesting. Well, I'm also a lark, so I get up early as a default, but I think the challenge I have is, I ended up building a writing shed in the backyard for exactly this reason, to get away from the house and all of the stuff. And so if I can make myself get up, have my tea and meds, and go to the writing shed and open the computer, then I'll start writing. But if I fail to go to the space, then no writing happens that day often, it's just that one step. So I end up having to ritualize it a lot. It was easier when I was living alone in Utah during grad school and I was writing Bodies in Motion. Kevin and I had broken up. We had a bad breakup, so I was brokenhearted. Aww. I was super sad. He'd left. I had some friends, but I was just sad. I was crying all the time. And go to class, come home and cry. And so it was perfect for writing because I would wake up at 4 in the morning and I'd be like, ugh, and I'd go and make my tea. I'd go to the computer, I'd light a candle, and open the file. I had some music that I was listening to. I think it was the Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon soundtrack at that point.
I love
It's a great soundtrack. So, and then I'd start writing and could just write for hours while the world was dark. It was actually kind of key that everybody else was asleep, and it felt like it was just me and the words. And then I'd finish, I'd go to classes, and then I'd go to bed. I'd go to bed by 8 o'clock. I had nothing to do.
Because you've been going since whenever, and you were sad anyway.
I was sad anyway. What was there to do except go to sleep? Yeah. But that worked for a chunk of my life, and I can't work that way anymore.
I've had to change it up several times when our circumstances have changed, and I've just learned to trust that I can change the routine enough and still get what I need out of it. And it's not that I never wake up and feel like, oh my God, do I really want to go down the hall and write? But I know from experience of having done it hundreds and hundreds of times that I'm happier if I've spent 2 hours writing. Yeah. And how great to be able to spend 2 hours writing and then be happy.
Yeah.
Even at times where my life was absolutely shit and the effect wore off after a couple hours. Yeah. I usually get peace of mind out of it. And on those rare occasions when it's not working, I, open up a video game like every other human being in the world and dick around watching YouTube videos for 2 hours.
But it's different, right? Like, that's self-soothing. But writing, you actually can process things as you're writing, right? So it's, Kevin, if I start getting really cranky, Kevin will ask me, like, how long has it been since you've done any writing? And then I'll be like, oh yeah, it's been like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
That's why. Yeah. And he's like, okay, don't worry about the dishes, don't worry about the kids, go write.
But as an instructor or any kind of example, it makes me look really relentless from the outside. And so I'll have students or I'll have baby writers come to me and be like, well, what is your process? What do you write? And I'm always like, don't think that what I do is gonna be good for you, because all my career I've gone to cons and I've sat on panels with people who are like, here's the way. You're having trouble writing a novel, it's because you're not writing 6 novels a year. and I'm like, and I prefer not to get into fights on panels, but I would be like, fuck off, they're wrong, I'm sorry.
Nice. We'll bleep things as needed.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
I think the real answer is you try the thing that you've heard of and you see if it works for you.
Yeah.
And if some of it works, you decide if you can tweak it. And if none of it works, you say, okay, there are no experimental failures. There's only more data. And then you go looking for another thing. Like, I think the only true piece of advice is if you really want to try to have a writing life, you have to keep trying until you find the thing that works for you.
Yeah.
And if you keep looking, I do believe that in life, mostly we are lucky enough that if we keep looking for something, sooner or later we find it.
It really seems to connect, I think, to, in Child of a Hidden Sea, your protagonist, who is science-minded, but in a very ADHD, eclectic kind of way, following her interests where they lead at any given moment, which seems to work for her, as contrasted with her brother, who is very kind of studious-minded and will sit down with the books and kind of dive into it and, start at the beginning and work his way forward. And both approaches work for them, right? You just have to.
Bram, who is the methodical one, is a little relentless too. In Indigo Springs and Blue Magic, the 2 books that preceded the trilogy, the main character Astrid is really quite self-contained, and it's because she's sort of she's inherited the role of the secret keeper of this magic that she didn't know about and doesn't understand, but she always grew up knowing she had a secret. It's not at all a metaphor for being queer, not at all. And that it was life-threatening, right? That people would want to kill her if they knew about it. So when I went to write Child of a Hidden Sea, we had been through a fair number of sort of sad things. There had been a lot of family funerals. And Blue Magic ends in a way that I hope is a slight up note, but it's after hundreds of thousands of people have died. Like, the magical recovery does not go well. And I just wanted to write something that wasn't sad, and I wanted to write with a protagonist who wasn't so emotionally locked down. So I wanted someone who was wildly emotional and driven to follow their whims, and who wouldn't, like, compassionately listen to what someone else had to say and think, oh, okay, I can work with that. Who would be like, you're wrong. It's totally wrong. And in fact, I don't like that answer, so I'm going to go looking for another one. And it was a really good exercise. I was basically pushing against something that I was starting to see as a pattern in my work.
That's really interesting. It's working for me.
But I kept Bram because that little piece of myself is also important to me.
So Kelly, what about you? I think you do not follow the same sort of work patterns.
Well, my second trunk novel, I tried writing early in the morning. We got up at 4:30 in the morning, and I would write for an hour and a half, and then start getting ready for work. And it was the worst for me. Yeah, it screwed up my sleep patterns. It was not good. It took 2 years to get my sleep patterns back to normal.
Oh, no.
So I just could not do it. Yeah. Couldn't do it. Plus, it was terrible because I need 8 hours of sleep, so we were having to go to bed at 8.
Yep.
No, doesn't work. So, what my pattern has been since 2013 is to write after supper for an hour or two, and to write in the mornings on the weekends.
Okay.
That is what I have been doing. But right now I don't have a job, so I am writing from 8 till noon every day, every weekday, and then maybe on the weekends.
So it's very different when whether you have a day job or not. You have to adapt to that.
Yeah, for sure.
Are you finding, is it difficult to be disciplined for that 8 to 12 stretch now?
No, it's
great.
not. No, it's fantastic. It's my dream. It's really, really nice. Actually, I will pedal on backwards on that one a little bit. I find drafting to be really difficult. I love revising. Drafting is hard for me, and it's exhausting. So I will, start looking to the clock at like 10:30, 11 and go, can I really keep going on this? And then try to judge, do I really need to stop? Am I really that tired? Am I really that stuck? Or do I need to keep going till noon? Yeah. And it'll depend from day to day. I don't try to force myself to draft if it's not working for me, because what I find is that usually if I force myself to draft when I don't know what direction I should go in, I'll take it in the wrong direction, and then it's a really painful revision.
Yeah, I find that my writing gets just boring. It gets sort of labored, and it's workmanlike. I've been doing this long enough that I can do workmanlike, but it's not my best work.
Yeah, sentence by sentence, it's fine. Yeah, me too. Sentence by sentence is absolutely fine, but
it's not alive.
It's not alive, and it is not going to work, and it's just going to get cut. Thousands of words will get cut.
Yeah. I also feel, I don't know whether you guys have this, so I love to garden, and I find that if I start the day with some gardening, or it could be going for a walk, or it could be taking a shower, but like having a sort of pre-writing space where I'm moving but thinking about the story, then by the time I sit down to write, the key is to actually sit down and write and not go off and do other things, but I can get into a lively draft mode.
Interesting.
Nice.
I wonder if that's because you're moving your hands.
I'm sure. I'm sure it's like the physicality of it, right? Is very helpful. And I even sometimes I take my computer down and I work on the treadmill. I've put a board over the treadmill, and I do it at a slow walk, and I write there, and I think I write better there sometimes because like the blood is going to my brain. I'm moving. It's not weird.
I have a friend who has a treadmill desk.
Yeah.
And that's what she is on every day, all day.
Yeah.
I'm kind of the opposite. I do the writing, and then I need a walk. And the walk is, I think, the part where I process whatever it is I have written, so that when I go to transcribe it, I know which parts to carve in more deeply.
Because you have this two-stage process of the drafting and then the transcribing, right? That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And then the multiple rewrites.
So, all right. So we're almost out of time. I thought we'd just end. If you could tell our listeners maybe either something new that you have coming out or a good starting point for your work would be a great place to leave them, I think. So.
I have a short fiction collection that is available as an ebook.
Oh, great.
It's also available as a beautiful hardcover, signed limited edition from Subterranean Press. But the ebook is cheaper. And it has, I think, 13 of my stories and notes to go along with each one of them.
And it has a title?
Yes, it does have. The title is Alias Space. And other stories. Alias Space being a play on the title of Margaret Atwood's book, Alias Grace.
Oh, nice. All right. So.
Well, we've talked a lot about Child of a Hidden Sea and that trilogy, and they're great books. I'm really proud of them. I think they haven't gotten very old yet. They weren't written that long ago, but I feel like they've continued to hold up, and they're fun. They're rollicks. But I'm also inordinately proud of my two L.X. Beckett books, Game Changer and Deal Breaker. They are also romps, and they're romps in a world that I would like to think we could build out of the ashes of the climate catastrophe. So they have lots and lots of queer characters and lots of polyamorous marriages and lots of green technology, and they sort of loop around the world in the first one and loop around the solar system in the second one, and they're fun. They're serious and they're fun.
Sounds like a blast. So we'll link all of these in our notes, and we'll link all of your stuff, so it should be easy to find. Thank you both so much for taking the time to do this at the end of a long and tiring convention. So I can fly back to Toronto and rest for a little.
It was a joy.
Yeah.
The bar for tomorrow is for neither of us to end up in hospital, which is a joke. Totally a joke. It's not likely.
They're going to go home and sleep, and so am I. So thank you, everybody, and come back soon. All right.
Thank you so much.
Hey humans, don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and more, so that you don't miss future episodes of Mohanraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans. Leaving us a good rating also helps us reach a wider audience. Engage with us on Twitter at MRAH Podcast, and check out our weekly clips of episodes. If you want to reach us directly to ask questions or continue the conversation, you can email us at mrahpodcast@specklet.org.
This podcast is hosted by Anne Mohanraj and Benjamin Rosenbaum. Editing and show notes by Darius Vinisar. Music composed by Thor Bremer. And cover art by Stephanie Bailey. Thanks for tuning in to Mohanraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans.